Some monsters don't lurk under beds. They share your family's dinner table, weaving a web of toxicity so insidious it can make you question the very meaning of blood. Tonight, I'm pulling back the curtain on a family secret, a chilling tale of manipulation, desperation, and a twisted obsession with race that drove one woman to attempt the unthinkable. Right at that moment when I thought I understood the worst that family toxicity could offer, I was forced to confront a woman whose manipulation and racism runs so deep that she would literally attempt to purchase human beings to satisfy her twisted obsession with white supremacy and social status. Let me introduce you to Mary, because understanding who she is makes what she tried to do to my family so much more horrifying. Mary is married to my uncle, and in over 30 years of witnessing human behavior in customer service and even working in politics under a totalitarian government, I can honestly say she represents the absolute worst of humanity. She is manipulative, classist, racist, and so desperate for social status that she will destroy anyone who stands between her and her fantasy of being perceived as superior. I normally avoid this toxic side of my family like the plague, but occasionally there are gatherings where we're forced to interact, and every single time Mary reminds me why she's the most dangerous person I know. Just yesterday, at what should have been a peaceful family gathering to meet a new baby and remember my recently deceased aunt, Mary managed to turn the entire event into her personal stage for displaying her narcissism and complete lack of human decency. She spent the evening trying to become best friends with my wealthy boss, brought a high-risk friend who should have been quarantined, attempted to upstage a 1-month-old baby with her grown daughters, took over hosting duties in someone else's house, and served food that wasn't meant for guests. But the most disgusting display came during our moment of prayer for my deceased aunt, who had been like a second mother to me and was deeply loved by our entire family. Mary decided that since we were remembering the dead, she would take charge of the prayers and make herself the central figure. She pulled out a large photograph of her own mother, who had died 10 years earlier, and placed it directly in front of my aunt's picture, covering it almost completely. Then she launched into an elaborate speech about missing her mother while dismissing my aunt's recent death with nothing more than a casual rest in peace. This behavior is exactly what I've come to expect from Mary over the decades. She has a pathological need to be the center of attention, the most successful, the most wealthy, the most beautiful, and most importantly, the most socially acceptable person in any room. She competes with everyone about everything: who has the most expensive clothes, the most exotic vacations, the happiest marriage, the most successful career. But there's one area where her competition becomes truly sinister, and that's when it comes to the physical appearance and racial characteristics of family members. You see, Mary lives in a fantasy world where she believes she has royal blood and superior genetics, despite the reality being quite different. She was born in one of the least developed states in our country, in a humble family, in a small town where generations of people have worked under the sun and developed the darker skin that's completely normal for our region. She married my uncle, who comes from a family that has lived on an island for generations and who is the darkest skinned of all his siblings. But Mary's desperate need to appear racially superior would soon drive her to make the most shocking proposition I've ever heard, targeting my unborn brother in a scheme so calculated and evil that it would forever change how I understood the depths of internalized racism. No one expected that a simple pregnancy announcement would trigger the kind of jealous rage that would drive someone to contemplate purchasing a human being, but Mary's reaction to my mother's news revealed the terrifying depths of her competitive obsession and racial anxieties. When I was around 10 years old, my mother gathered our extended family together to share the wonderful news that she was pregnant with my brother. For most families, this would be a moment of celebration, joy, and anticipation for a new addition to our clan. But Mary's reaction was immediate and visceral. This wasn't good news to her. This was a direct threat to her social standing and a painful reminder of her own perceived failures as a woman. You have to understand the family dynamics that were at play here to fully grasp why Mary's jealousy reached such dangerous levels. Among the 7 siblings in my mother's generation, Mary was married to one of the older brothers, making her one of the senior wives in the family hierarchy. She had been desperately trying to get pregnant for years, watching as one sister-in-law after another successfully had children while she remained childless. By the time my mother announced her second pregnancy, Mary was the only wife without children, despite being one of the oldest and theoretically most established in the family structure. But this wasn't just about wanting children. This was about Mary's pathological need to be superior to everyone around her in every measurable way. She had to have the most money, wear the most expensive clothing, work the most prestigious job, travel to the most exotic destinations, and maintain the most enviable marriage. Every aspect of her life was carefully curated to project an image of perfection and superiority that she desperately needed others to acknowledge and admire. The fact that my mother, who was married to Mary's younger brother-in-law, was about to have her second child while Mary remained childless was absolutely unbearable to her. This wasn't just a personal disappointment in Mary's twisted worldview. This was a public humiliation that threatened the entire facade of perfection she had spent years constructing. My mother was also one of the lightest-skinned siblings in the family, which added another layer to Mary's jealousy that I wouldn't fully understand until years later. In Mary's mind, my mother already had advantages that she desperately wanted for herself, and now she was going to have another child to showcase those advantages while Mary continued to struggle with infertility. The competitive dynamic between them wasn't new. Mary had always treated family gatherings like competitions where she needed to prove her superiority. She would make subtle comments about other people's financial situations, criticize their lifestyle choices, and find ways to highlight her own supposed advantages. But a pregnancy announcement was different because it represented something Mary couldn't buy, couldn't fake, and couldn't compete with through material possessions or career achievements. As the months progressed and my mother's pregnancy became more visible, Mary's jealousy transformed from general resentment into something much more focused and calculating. She began to see this pregnancy not just as a reminder of her own struggles, but as an opportunity to solve multiple problems at once. What Mary was planning would go far beyond normal family jealousy or even typical manipulation. She was about to propose something so morally reprehensible that it would expose the true depths of her racist beliefs and her willingness to treat human beings as commodities. But the tragedy had not stopped yet. In fact, Mary's jealousy was about to manifest in the most disturbing proposition I've ever heard, when she decided that if she couldn't have her own baby, she would simply purchase someone else's child and claim it as her own. One day, when my mother was about 4 months pregnant, Mary approached her privately and made what can only be described as the most calculated and morally reprehensible offer in our family's history. She pulled my mother aside, away from the rest of the family, and began what she probably thought was a reasonable business proposition disguised as family concern. "You know it isn't fair that you get pregnant before us," Mary began, her voice dripping with fake sympathy and barely concealed resentment. "It wasn't fair for you to have your first child before your brother since he's older than you. But whatever, it can't be helped if that was just an accident or something." The condescension in her tone was already setting the stage for what was coming next, treating my mother's pregnancies like personal attacks against Mary's social standing. But then Mary moved into the truly horrifying part of her proposal. "But you know we've been trying for years now, and we're just exhausted. And we're not comfortable with trying those artificial methods nor having a baby without our blood. So, since you're familially we..." She drew out the word like it was some kind of magical justification for what she was about to suggest. "And we know you are not in a financial position to take care of another baby right now. What would you say if I offered to pay for everything pregnancy-related, and after the baby is born I would pay you a substantial amount for keeping it as your brother's and my baby?" Let that sink in for a moment. Mary was literally trying to purchase my unborn brother. She was proposing to pay my mother throughout the pregnancy, cover all medical expenses, and then hand over a lump sum of money in exchange for a newborn baby that she would raise as her own child. This wasn't adoption through proper channels. This wasn't a surrogate arrangement with legal protections. This was a straight-up, attempted purchase of a human being from a family member. My mother was horrified and immediately rejected the offer, but Mary didn't take no for an answer. This wasn't a desperate moment of poor judgment that Mary quickly regretted. This was the beginning of a sustained campaign of harassment that would continue for months. She kept approaching my parents with variations of the same offer, applying pressure, using emotional manipulation, and trying different angles to convince them to sell her their baby. The persistence was almost as disturbing as the original proposition. Mary continued her attempts to buy my brother throughout the remaining 5 months of my mother's pregnancy, and even after he was born, she kept trying to convince my parents to hand him over. She would bring up their financial situation, suggest that she could provide better opportunities, and constantly remind them of her superior economic status as justification for why she deserved their child more than they did. But here's the part that makes this story even more sickening. Mary's motivation wasn't really about infertility or maternal instincts. She had identified something specific about my potential brother that made him valuable to her twisted worldview, something that had to do with genetics, appearance, and her desperate need for social status. What I was about to discover about Mary's true motivations would reveal a level of internalized racism so profound that it would forever change how I understood the destructive power of colorism within families. Right at that moment when I thought Mary's baby-buying scheme couldn't get any more disturbing, I discovered the true reason behind her obsession with my unborn brother, and it had nothing to do with maternal instincts and everything to do with her twisted belief that having a white child would solve all her problems in life. The key to understanding Mary's calculated targeting of my brother lies in her complete delusion about her own racial identity and her desperate obsession with appearing to have superior genetics. Mary has spent her entire adult life trying to convince everyone, including herself, that she possesses what she calls royal blood and comes from some kind of aristocratic European lineage. The reality couldn't be more different, and the contrast between her fantasy and the truth reveals the depths of her internalized racism. Mary was born in one of the least developed states in our country, in a humble family that had lived in a small rural town for generations. The people in her hometown, including her own relatives, were working-class folks who had spent generations laboring under the sun, developing the darker skin tone that's completely normal and beautiful in our heavily race-mixed nation. There is absolutely nothing shameful about her background, but Mary has convinced herself that her origins are somehow inferior and need to be hidden or overcome. When she married my uncle, she didn't just gain a husband, she gained access to his family's social connections and financial resources. But she also married into a family where my uncle is actually the darkest-skinned of all his siblings, having grown up on an island where his family had lived for generations. In any rational world, this would be completely irrelevant information, but in Mary's twisted racist mindset, this presented a major obstacle to her fantasy of producing children who would look European. Here's where the calculated nature of her baby-buying scheme becomes truly sickening. My mother happens to be one of the lightest-skinned siblings in our family, and she married my father, who is the son of European immigrants with clear Italian and Polish genetic heritage. My father is genuinely handsome with distinctly European features, and when I was born, I inherited his pale skin and smooth hair texture, characteristics that Mary obsessed over and envied. Mary knew that there was a strong statistical probability that my brother would be born with what she considered desirable European features, light skin, straight hair, and facial characteristics that would allow him to pass as white in social situations where that might provide advantages. She had done the genetic math in her head and realized that my parents were likely to produce exactly the kind of child she desperately wanted but could never have naturally. In our region, hair texture is often discussed in terms that reflect deep-rooted colorism. Mary and her husband both have what's locally described as difficult hair, meaning very thick, tightly curled hair that requires different care and styling. This isn't inherently negative, but Mary has internalized racist beauty standards that make her see her own natural features as flaws that need to be corrected or hidden. The most disturbing aspect of Mary's plan was how calculated it was. She hadn't approached any other pregnant family members with similar offers. She hadn't tried to buy children from families with different genetic backgrounds. She had specifically targeted my mother's pregnancy because she believed she could acquire a white-appearing child who would elevate her social status and fulfill her fantasy of having superior genetics. What I didn't know was that Mary's racist obsessions would eventually lead her to make statements so openly disgusting about her own family that they would expose the true depths of her internalized white supremacy and self-hatred. No one expected that a 10-year-old child wandering around a birthday party would accidentally witness the most racist confession imaginable. But what I overheard Mary saying about her own daughter would expose the absolute depths of her internalized white supremacy and self-hatred. The revelation of Mary's true motivations came years later, when I was still just a child trying to enjoy what should have been an innocent family celebration. I was at Mary's daughter's birthday party, minding my own business and probably looking for cake, or trying to avoid boring adult conversations, when I happened to wander close to where Mary was talking with someone I didn't recognize, apparently a friend or acquaintance from outside our family. What I heard in that moment would haunt me for the rest of my life and forever change how I understood the poison that racism can inject into families. Mary was speaking openly, apparently feeling safe because she thought no children were listening, and the words that came out of her mouth were so shocking that I initially couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was complaining, with genuine anger and resentment in her voice, about how her daughter was black. Not mixed race. Not brown-skinned. Not any of the more nuanced terms that might acknowledge the beautiful complexity of our multiracial country. She used the term black like it was a curse, like it was a personal tragedy that had befallen her specifically. But then came the part that made my blood run cold. Mary openly admitted to this stranger that she wished she had managed to convince my parents to give her their baby, because having a white son would have solved all of her problems. She explained, with disturbing casualness, how difficult it was to move up the social ladder when you have what she called a black family, and how having a white child would have provided the social advantages she desperately craved. The conversation got even more horrifying as Mary continued to destroy her own daughter with her words. She called her own child ugly, stating matter-of-factly that there was no way her daughter would ever be able to marry a rich man because of her appearance. Mary was literally planning her retirement strategy around her daughter's potential marriage prospects, and she had already written off those prospects because her child didn't meet her racist beauty standards. She talked about her daughter like she was a failed investment, a disappointment that couldn't provide the social mobility that Mary had been counting on. The coldness in her voice, as she discussed her own child's future, was absolutely chilling. This wasn't a moment of frustration or a private doubt that most parents might have. This was a calculated assessment of her daughter's worth based entirely on racial appearance and social utility. The most devastating part was listening to Mary explain how she had specifically targeted my family's pregnancy because she knew there was a high probability of producing a European-looking child. She had done the genetic calculations, identified the opportunity, and developed a plan to acquire the kind of baby that would fulfill her white supremacist fantasies while solving what she saw as her social and economic problems. Throughout this entire conversation, Mary spoke with the confidence of someone who believed her racist views were completely reasonable and justified. She wasn't whispering or showing any shame about her beliefs when she was explaining her worldview to someone she assumed would understand and sympathize with her position. What made this confession even more sickening was the knowledge that Mary's husband, my uncle, not only knew about her racist beliefs but actively supported and encouraged them, creating a household where internalized white supremacy was treated as normal family values. But the tragedy had not stopped yet. In fact, the most disturbing revelation was still to come when I realized that Mary's racist behavior wasn't happening in isolation, but was being actively supported and enabled by my uncle and tolerated by our entire extended family system. My uncle's reaction to Mary's openly racist statements about their own daughter was perhaps even more shocking than Mary's original confession. Rather than being horrified by his wife's white supremacist views or protective of his child's dignity, he actively approved of and patronized Mary's behavior. Here were two dark-skinned people who had somehow become convinced that white supremacy was not only acceptable but necessary for their family's success and social advancement. The cognitive dissonance was staggering to witness. My uncle would nod along as Mary made disparaging comments about their daughter's appearance, agree with her assessments about the social advantages of lighter skin, and even participate in conversations about how they could improve their family's racial profile. They had internalized racist beliefs so completely that they were willing to psychologically damage their own child in service of a white supremacist ideology that would never truly accept them anyway. This dynamic extended beyond just Mary and my uncle. It revealed a pattern of enabling behavior throughout our extended family that allowed this toxicity to flourish unchecked. Family gatherings became spaces where Mary's racist comments were met with uncomfortable silence rather than direct confrontation. Relatives would change the subject or make excuses rather than challenge her openly discriminatory statements about family members based on skin color and physical features. The most haunting aspect of this family dysfunction was watching how it affected the children, particularly Mary's daughters who grew up hearing their mother's racist assessments of their worth and potential. The psychological damage of having a parent who openly considers you inferior based on racial characteristics is something that no child should ever experience. Yet our family system allowed it to continue year after year. But perhaps the most mysterious and disturbing element of Mary's story involves her second daughter, the one who popped out of nowhere, as I mentioned earlier. This child appeared in their family suddenly, with no pregnancy announcement, no preparation period, and most tellingly, with physical characteristics that looked nothing like either Mary or my uncle. This white-appearing daughter represents everything Mary had been trying to achieve through her attempted purchase of my brother, and the circumstances of her arrival raise questions that our family has never been willing to address directly. The pattern of Mary's behavior over the decades reveals someone who will stop at nothing to achieve her vision of social superiority. I mentioned earlier that I have over 100 stories about her manipulative and entitled behavior, from trying to upstage babies at family gatherings to making herself the center of prayer services for deceased relatives. Each incident represents another example of someone who sees other people, including family members, as objects to be used in service of her own narcissistic goals. What makes Mary's story particularly relevant today is how it illustrates the insidious nature of internalized racism and colorism within families and communities. This isn't just about individual prejudice. It's about how racist beauty standards and social hierarchies can become so embedded in people's thinking that they're willing to literally purchase children, psychologically abuse their own offspring, and destroy family relationships in pursuit of white approval and social acceptance. The most tragic truth about Mary's story is that her desperate pursuit of whiteness and social status has ultimately isolated her from genuine human connections, leaving her surrounded by people who tolerate her presence while secretly recognizing the poison she brings to every relationship and gathering. The most dangerous racism lives within families, disguised as love while destroying children's souls through internalized white supremacy. When parents view their own offspring as genetic failures and attempt to purchase better babies, we see how deeply poison can corrupt blood bonds. True family protection sometimes means confronting the monsters who share our DNA. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button to help others find it. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. And subscribe to join our community of resilient souls who've learned that sometimes being underestimated is your greatest superpower. Together, we're writing new endings to old stories, and I can't wait to share the next chapter with you.